Maps create a dangerous illusion. They suggest that when a symbol disappears, something is missing. In military planning, the opposite is often true. Absence is not emptiness. It is a signal that something has changed. When the USS Abraham Lincoln left the Pacific, analysts did what analysts always do. They measured tonnage. They counted aircraft. They traced coverage arcs on digital displays. And many of them reached the same conclusion. A gap had opened. A carrier strike group had moved west. 100,000 tons of steel and nuclear power were no longer holding a familiar position. On the surface, the math looked simple. Less mass, less deterrence, more risk. That assumption rests on an old habit of thought. It treats presence as strength and movement as weakness. It assumes that power must remain visible to remain credible. But naval history is filled with moments where visibility became liability, and stillness became exposure. What matters is not where a ship was yesterday, but what problem it was designed to solve today. The departure of Lincoln did not remove American power from the Pacific. It forced a question that is harder and less comfortable to answer. What kind of power actually survives here? From a distance, the South China Sea looks like open water. In reality, it is a confined geometry, island chains, shallow depths, dense sensor coverage, and weapons built for one purpose only: to find large things and destroy them before they can react. In that environment, size does not automatically equal safety. It can mean predictability. So when observers describe what followed Lincoln's departure as a vacuum, they are projecting a familiar fear onto an unfamiliar problem. They are assuming the United States Navy intended to leave something unguarded. That assumption is the first mistake. Because what emerged next was not a replacement in kind. It was a replacement in logic. A ship that does not announce itself the way a supercarrier does. A ship that appears smaller, slower, and by traditional standards, weaker. And yet, it was sent precisely because those standards no longer define survival. This is not the story of a retreat. It is the story of a substitution, one that only makes sense if you stop asking what was lost and start asking what kind of war is actually being prepared for. To understand why the Pentagon accepted the risk of moving a Nimitz-class carrier away from the Pacific, you have to ignore the headlines and remove intent from the analysis. This decision was not emotional. It was mechanical. Military planners did not ask where they wanted to signal strength. They asked where force could physically reach its target. In the Middle East, the problem was distance. Fixed airfields were either politically constrained or within predictable strike envelopes. Targets of interest were buried deep, protected by terrain and reinforced concrete. Hitting them required not just stealth, but range and payload. That narrowed the solution set quickly. Only the carrier-based F-35C, with its long wings, internal fuel volume, and extended combat radius, could do that job without constant tanker support. And only one carrier in the region was configured to deploy that specific capability at scale. From a purely physical standpoint, Abraham Lincoln was not interchangeable. She was purpose-built for that geometry. The order to redeploy her did not reflect confidence or anxiety. It reflected necessity. But physics never solves one problem without creating another. Removing the Lincoln from the Pacific raised a second question, one planners could not ignore. What remains behind when the heaviest tool leaves the toolbox? The instinctive answer is vulnerability. Allies see fewer decks, fewer fighters, a reduced visible presence. But that interpretation assumes that the Pacific in 2026 rewards the same attributes it did 20 years ago. It assumes that endurance comes from mass and deterrence from permanence. That assumption collapses when examined under threat modeling. In the Western Pacific, the primary danger is not absence, it is concentration. Ballistic and hypersonic anti-ship weapons are optimized for a single task: locating large, predictable targets inside constrained waters. Against that threat, the question is not how much power you can bring, but how much power you can avoid losing. Seen through that lens, moving the Lincoln was not a gamble. It was risk redistribution. She was not leaving a gap. She was removing herself from a firing solution. Which means the real decision was not about sending a carrier west. It was about what kind of asset could remain east without becoming a liability. What kind of ship could operate inside the problem space instead of towering above it? That question leads away from politics and away from tradition. It leads directly into engineering trade-offs that look irrational until you understand what they are meant to survive. In confined waters, scale behaves differently. What offers protection in the open ocean can become exposure near a hostile coastline. A supercarrier brings unmatched capability, but it also brings certainty. Its location matters. Its movements are tracked. Its presence shapes every calculation around it. For decades, that certainty worked in America's favor. The assumption was simple. No adversary would dare strike such a platform, because the response would be overwhelming. But that logic depends on one condition: that the carrier cannot be reliably hit. Over the last 20 years, potential competitors focused their effort on breaking that condition. They did not try to match carriers ship for ship. They built weapons to deny space. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, long-range cruise missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles. Systems designed to compress reaction time and expand the kill zone outward from the coast. Not to guarantee destruction, but to make presence expensive. Inside the first island chain, a supercarrier is not maneuvering in open geometry. It is operating inside overlapping sensor fields, limited sea room, and fixed missile baselines. In that environment, the carrier is no longer just a tool. It is a reference point, something the enemy can plan around. This does not make the carrier obsolete. It changes its role. It becomes most valuable when distance protects it, when its air wing can reach far beyond the envelope designed to kill the ship itself. When that distance collapses, the logic flips. What was once deterrence becomes risk concentration. That is the uncomfortable truth planners rarely state publicly. Keeping a 100,000-ton vessel carrying thousands of personnel inside a static threat box is not an act of resolve. It is a wager that the enemy's math is wrong. So when the Abraham Lincoln moved out of that geometry, she was not yielding ground. She was stepping outside a solution set that had been built specifically to destroy her. That move only makes sense if something else is ready to operate inside that space. Something that does not reward the enemy's investment in scale. This is where the analysis breaks for many observers. They expect the replacement to mirror what left. Another carrier, another symbol, another large object to balance the equation. Instead, the Navy introduced something that does not balance the equation at all. It distorts it. The USS Tripoli does not look like an answer to a superpower problem. At first glance, it looks like a compromise. No nuclear reactor, no catapults. A hull that displaces barely half the mass of the ship it is associated with in the public mind. If presence were measured by size alone, this would appear to be a step backward. That reaction is understandable. Naval thinking has been trained for generations to equate scale with seriousness. Bigger decks mean more aircraft mean more options, and options, in theory, mean control. But that logic only holds if the environment allows those options to be exercised. The Tripoli was not designed to dominate an ocean. She was designed to function inside it. That distinction matters. Her apparent limitations are not accidents. They are the visible results of deliberate subtraction. Where a traditional amphibious assault ship prioritizes flexibility, troops, vehicles, medical capacity, the Tripoli abandons much of that heritage. The well deck, long considered the defining feature of amphibious warfare, is gone. Hospital space is reduced. Capabilities that make sense in uncontested landings were removed without apology. What replaces them is not versatility, but focus. Internal volume is repurposed. Fuel capacity increases. Aviation support systems are expanded. The ship stops trying to be many things at once and commits to a single role, sustaining aircraft operations without drawing attention to itself. To observers expecting a one-for-one replacement of a carrier, this looks like downgrading, but the comparison is flawed. The Tripoli is not meant to substitute for a supercarrier's strength. She is meant to avoid the conditions under which that strength becomes a liability. The question is no longer how much force she carries, but how long she can remain useful without being targeted. How often she can launch, recover, refuel, and reposition aircraft without advertising her location. Understanding that shift requires setting aside familiar benchmarks. The Tripoli is not an answer to the last war's assumptions. She is a response to a future where endurance matters more than spectacle. The most revealing feature of the Tripoli is not what she carries, but what she deliberately gave up. The removal of the well deck was not a budget cut or an oversight. It was a decision that broke with half a century of amphibious doctrine. For decades, the well deck defined purpose. It allowed ships to flood themselves, deploy landing craft, hovercraft, armored vehicles. It was the physical expression of one idea. Force moves from sea to shore in a single decisive motion. That idea assumes access. It assumes time. It assumes that the shoreline is something you can approach. In the Western Pacific, those assumptions no longer hold. By eliminating the well deck, engineers reclaimed a massive internal volume. That space did not disappear. It was converted into fuel tanks, maintenance areas, and aviation support infrastructure. The result was simple but profound. The Tripoli stopped being a transport platform and became an endurance platform. Fuel is not dramatic, but it is decisive. Every additional gallon of JP5 translates directly into more sorties, longer loiter times, and greater operational flexibility. In modern air warfare, the ability to keep aircraft flying matters more than how many you can launch at once. Persistence outperforms surge. This is the quiet logic behind the redesign. The Navy accepted that it would not conduct large-scale amphibious assaults inside heavily contested waters without first reshaping the battle space. Instead of planning to land forces immediately, it prioritized the ability to sustain pressure over time. That trade-off looks risky if you expect ships to perform every mission. It looks rational if you accept that no ship survives by being everything at once. The Tripoli's value lies in repetition. Launch, recover, refuel. Again and again. Not for a day, but for weeks. In that cycle, the ship itself fades into the background. What remains visible is the effect. This is not flexibility in the traditional sense. It is commitment to a single variable, chosen carefully. The variable is not speed, not firepower, not symbolism. It is sortie rate. Sustaining a high sortie rate creates a problem that does not appear on maps or threat briefings. It appears on the flight deck. The F-35B is unlike any aircraft the Navy has operated at scale from a ship this size. Its defining feature, vertical landing, solves one set of constraints while introducing another. When the aircraft descends, its engine exhaust is redirected downward with extreme force. The temperature at the point of contact exceeds levels most naval materials were never meant to endure. Traditional non-skid coatings fail quickly under that heat. They blister, peel, and fragment. Those fragments do not just damage the deck. They become foreign objects that can be ingested by the engine during the next landing. Steel beneath the coating begins to absorb thermal stress unevenly, leading to warping and microfractures. Over time, the deck itself becomes the limiting factor, not the aircraft. For the Tripoli, this was not a hypothetical concern. High sortie rates mean frequent vertical recoveries. That makes thermal management a matter of survival, not maintenance. The solution was not thicker paint or better procedures. It required abandoning the idea of paint altogether. Instead, the deck was treated as a structural component of the aircraft system. Engineers applied a thermal spray non-skid coating, bonding a metallic alloy directly to the steel using high-energy arc spraying. The result is not a barrier, but a heat-managing surface. Unlike epoxy coatings, this metallic layer does not trap energy, it spreads it. Heat is dissipated laterally across the deck, reducing peak stress and preventing localized failure. The surface remains rough enough for traction, but stable enough to endure repeated exposure to extreme temperatures. This adaptation is easy to overlook because it does not change the silhouette of the ship, but it changes how long the ship can remain useful under constant flight operations. Without it, the Tripoli would be limited not by enemy action, but by physics. This is the pattern that defines the ship. Each apparent limitation forces an engineering response. Each response narrows the mission further. The Tripoli is not versatile. She is optimized. And optimization always comes with a cost. The cost of optimization becomes unavoidable when you examine the aircraft itself. No amount of deck hardening can change the internal geometry of the F-35B. To achieve vertical landing, engineers placed a large lift fan directly behind the cockpit. Power from the main engine is diverted through a shaft, generating enormous upward thrust during hover. The system works, but it consumes space that would otherwise belong to fuel tanks and weapon bays. This is not a minor compromise. It defines the aircraft's limits. Reduced internal volume shortens range and constrains payload. Compared to the carrier-based F-35C, the B variant carries less fuel and operates with a smaller combat radius. More importantly, its internal weapons bay is shorter. That difference appears trivial until it meets reality. Certain munitions are designed to fit inside the longer bay of the F-35C and nowhere else. Heavy bunker-penetrating weapons built to defeat deeply buried targets simply exceed the physical dimensions of the F-35B's bay. They do not fit. No software update, no sensor upgrade, no tactical innovation can change that. As a result, the F-35B operates with smaller internal weapons. The aircraft remains stealthy, but its strike profile shifts. It trades raw penetration for flexibility. It can still hit targets, but not the same targets, and not in the same way. On paper, this looks like a loss. A smaller radius, a lighter punch. By traditional metrics, the exchange is unfavorable. If the mission is to destroy hardened facilities deep inland, the F-35B is not the optimal tool. But the Western Pacific is not defined by deeply buried bunkers. It is defined by movement, by maritime traffic, by distributed targets that appear and disappear. In that environment, range matters less than access, and persistence matters more than single strikes. A sledgehammer is only useful if you can swing it. Inside contested waters, heavy tools struggle to find room. Lighter tools survive by moving. The F-35B reflects that reality. It does not solve every problem. It accepts that it never will. Its value lies in where it can operate, not in what it can destroy. That shift reframes the entire exchange. The question stops being what the aircraft lacks and becomes what the battle space actually demands. In the South China Sea, concentration invites attention. Attention invites targeting. Survival depends on avoiding both. The strength of the F-35B is not that it replaces the reach of larger aircraft, but that it breaks the assumption of fixed basing. It does not require long, pristine runways or massive decks to operate. It can launch from ships that do not resemble carriers and recover to surfaces that were never meant to host jets at all. That capability changes the geometry of conflict. Air power is no longer tied to a few identifiable locations. It disperses. It relocates. It becomes harder to predict. A supercarrier projects power by existing in one place and daring others to challenge it. The Tripoli enables power to exist in many places, briefly and quietly. That distinction matters in a region saturated with sensors and long-range weapons. Dispersion is not an abstract concept. It requires logistics that can move faster than the enemy's targeting cycle. Fuel, munitions, and maintenance must follow the aircraft without forming patterns that can be exploited. This is where the design philosophy extends beyond the ship itself. The Tripoli does not need to be close to the fight. She needs to be close enough to support aircraft that can operate from multiple points. Her role is not to dominate a sector, but to enable presence without permanence. This is a slower form of pressure. It does not rely on shock, it relies on accumulation. Over time, dispersed operations exhaust an adversary's ability to track and respond. Every potential launch site becomes a question mark. Every movement demands attention. In that environment, invisibility is not a cloak. It is a workload imposed on the enemy. The more places you might be, the harder it becomes for them to act with confidence. But dispersion is meaningless if it cannot be sustained. Aircraft alone cannot move the war across empty water and isolated terrain. Something else is required. Something capable of carrying the fight to places that do not appear on any airfield map. That requirement introduces the most expensive and least intuitive component of the entire system. The price tag draws attention first. $147 million for a transport helicopter invites skepticism. It sounds excessive, even by modern defense standards. But cost only becomes irrational when you misunderstand what the machine is meant to do. The CH-53K King Stallion is not expensive because it flies. It is expensive because it lifts problems that geography was once allowed to create. Its 3 engines generate a level of power that pushes against practical limits. Early in development, that power nearly killed the program. During hover, the rotor wash forced hot exhaust gases back into the intakes. Engines began ingesting their own exhaust. Performance collapsed. The aircraft was, in effect, choking itself. Solving that required years of redesign. Airflow geometry was reshaped, control laws rewritten, materials reinforced. What emerged from that process was not elegance, but reliability under extreme conditions. The result is a helicopter that can lift loads once reserved for fixed infrastructure. 16 metric tons carried over open water at night without external support. That capacity changes what counts as a base. The aircraft does not move troops as its primary mission. It moves systems. Specifically, it moves weapons that do not announce themselves. Unmanned missile platforms that can be placed on terrain too small, too remote, or too exposed to host anything permanent. A barren rock becomes a firing position. A nameless island becomes a threat vector. The helicopter arrives, deposits the system, and leaves. Nothing remains visible. No runway. No ship. No signal. When a hostile vessel transits a narrow passage hours or days later, the response does not come from the sea or the air. It comes from land that was never meant to matter. By the time the launch is detected, the launcher is already gone, relocated by the same aircraft that delivered it. Seen this way, the cost begins to make sense. The helicopter is not a transport. It is a denial tool. It denies the enemy the ability to assume that empty terrain is irrelevant. The Tripoli does not carry this capability to use it constantly. She carries it so that it can appear unexpectedly. That unpredictability forces caution. Caution slows movement. Slowness creates vulnerability. Yet even with distributed weapons and mobile logistics, there is a final constraint that cannot be ignored. None of this works if you cannot see beyond the horizon. And on her own, the Tripoli cannot. Vision in naval warfare is limited by curvature, not ambition. A ship's sensors can only see so far before the Earth itself intervenes. Beyond that line, threats exist but remain undefined. In modern combat, that ignorance is fatal. When the Abraham Lincoln left the Pacific, she took with her the airborne early warning aircraft that traditionally solved this problem. Without those platforms, the Tripoli cannot extend her sensor horizon on her own. By conventional standards, she is blind. The response is not to restore what was lost, but to replace the function differently. The Tripoli does not operate as a solitary node. She functions as part of a distributed system, where sensing and shooting are deliberately separated. The aircraft she supports, the destroyers that escort her, and the networks that connect them are designed to compensate for each other's limits. An F-35B can move far ahead of the fleet without emitting a radar signal. Instead of searching actively, it listens. Passive sensors collect fragments of the electromagnetic environment, communications, navigation signals, radar emissions. Individually, these fragments mean little. Together, they form a track. That information does not go directly to a weapon. It passes through translation layers. Data links that reconcile different standards, different languages spoken by different platforms. The process is invisible to the operator, but essential to the outcome. A destroyer sailing miles away may see nothing on its own radar. No contact. No reflection. Yet its fire control system receives a solution that meets engagement criteria. A launch decision can be made without the shooter ever seeing the target. When the missile leaves the ship, it does so without a traditional lock. Guidance is based on shared data refined in flight. By the time the weapon reaches its terminal phase, the target has had no warning that it was ever being tracked. This arrangement unsettles observers because it removes familiar cues. There is no single platform to watch, no obvious center of gravity. The system survives by distributing risk across multiple nodes, none of which are decisive on their own. In this structure, the Tripoli does not need to see everything. She only needs to keep the network alive. Her value is not perception, but continuity. That is the final inversion. Strength no longer comes from what a ship can do by itself. It comes from how well it enables others to act without revealing themselves. From a distance, redeployment looks like absence. That is why it is so often misread. When the Abraham Lincoln slipped out of the Pacific frame, many assumed something had been removed. In reality, something had been rearranged. What disappeared was a familiar object, large, legible, easy to anchor analysis around. What replaced it was not a single platform, but a pattern. One that is harder to track and harder to exhaust. The United States Navy did not trade strength for subtlety. It traded concentration for resilience. A supercarrier is a statement. It declares presence and dares response. The Tripoli enables something quieter. It allows force to exist without insisting on being seen. This is not a reduction in commitment. It is an adjustment to constraint. The Pacific does not reward permanence anymore. It punishes predictability. The shift away from a visible fortress toward a distributed network reflects that reality, whether it is publicly acknowledged or not. None of this means the era of the supercarrier is over. Large platforms still matter. They still shape outcomes. But they no longer define every answer. In certain geometries, they step back, so other tools can step forward. What replaces them is not elegance. It is friction imposed on an adversary's planning. Uncertainty about where sensors are listening. Doubt about which empty island matters. Hesitation, born from the knowledge that the next threat may not come from the horizon at all. This is not a theory built on confidence. It is built on acceptance. Acceptance that visibility attracts fire, that mass attracts math, and that survival increasingly depends on denying the enemy clean solutions. The Pacific is not empty. It is saturated with signals, decisions, and constraints that never appear on a map. What matters now is not who looks strongest at a distance, but who forces the other side to hesitate first. The watch does not end with a conclusion. It remains set, waiting for the next calculation to be tested.